I'm Marcus Williams, 42 years old, and 3 months ago I walked out of Riverside Correctional Facility after serving 14 years for armed robbery, except the robbery never happened. The security footage that would have proven my innocence was deliberately hidden by the detective who needed to close the case. While I lost my 20s and 30s behind bars, my family moved on without me, believing I was guilty. But when I discovered that same detective had been promoted to police chief using my false conviction as his career highlight, I knew it was time for justice. The $30 million lawsuit I filed isn't just about the money, it's about exposing a system that destroyed an innocent man's life. Like and subscribe if you believe the truth always finds a way to surface, no matter how long it takes. March 15, 2009. I remember that date like it's burned into my soul because it's the day my life ended and this nightmare began. I was working late at Murphy's Auto Repair, trying to finish Mrs. Henderson's transmission before she needed her car the next morning. The smell of motor oil and the hum of fluorescent lights. That's what normal used to smell like. The arrest warrant they showed me that night was crisp and official, stamped with the county seal that somehow made their lies look legitimate. Detective Ray Morrison stood in my garage doorway at 9:47 p.m., his badge catching the overhead light, flanked by 2 uniformed officers whose hands rested casually on their weapons. Marcus Williams, you're under arrest for the armed robbery of First National Bank. I actually laughed, not because it was funny, but because the whole thing seemed so absurd. Me, rob a bank. I'd never even gotten a speeding ticket. I wiped my greasy hands on my coveralls and shook my head. There's been some mistake, officer. I've been here all day. Ask Murphy, he was here until 6. But Morrison's expression didn't change. Cold, determined, like he'd already decided I was guilty before he walked through that door. Sir, please turn around and place your hands behind your back. The handcuffs felt impossibly heavy. As they led me to the patrol car, I kept thinking this would all get sorted out at the station. Someone would check the security cameras at the bank, see that I wasn't there, and send me home with an apology. How naive I was. At the station, they showed me a grainy photo from what they claimed was the bank's security system, a black man in a baseball cap and dark jacket, about my height and build. The image was so blurry it could have been anyone, but Morrison pointed at it like it was my high school yearbook photo. That's you, Williams. March 15th, 3:22 p.m. You robbed First National of $47,000. I was at work. I insisted. Check with Murphy's, check the time cards, check anything. They did check Murphy's. Unfortunately, Murphy had left early that day for a doctor's appointment, and the shop didn't have security cameras. The time clock showed I'd punched in at 8 a.m. but hadn't punched out, something I often forgot to do when working late. To them, it looked like I'd left in the afternoon and came back to establish an alibi. The witness testimony came next. 3. Bank customers who said they could identify me in a lineup, except the lineup was a joke: 5 black men of varying heights and builds, with me being the only one who remotely matched the description. When you're the only person in a lineup wearing the suspect's approximate clothing size, the odds aren't exactly in your favor. My court-appointed attorney, David Phelps, was a tired man carrying too many cases. We met exactly 3 times before trial, each meeting lasting less than 30 minutes. He assured me the evidence was circumstantial, that the jury would see reasonable doubt. He never mentioned requesting the bank's security footage from other angles. He never questioned why the image quality was so poor when most banks had high systems by 2009. The trial lasted 4 days. 4 days to destroy a life built over 28 years. The prosecutor painted me as a desperate man who'd lost his job, which wasn't true. I'd been steadily employed and needed quick money. They said I'd cased the bank during lunch breaks, planned the robbery meticulously, then returned to work to create an alibi. My family sat in the front row every day. Mom in her best church dress, Sister Jennifer taking time off from her nursing, Job, even my nephew Tyler, just 12 then, fidgeting in his school clothes. They believed in me completely, their faces showing confusion rather than doubt, as the prosecution built their case with circumstantial evidence and questionable witness identifications. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood up and spoke words that still echo in my nightmares. We find the defendant guilty of armed robbery in the first degree. Mom's sob cut through the courtroom like a knife. Jennifer grabbed my hand as the bailiff approached with handcuffs. Tyler didn't understand why Uncle Marcus was being taken away, but he started crying because everyone else was crying. Judge Harrison sentenced me to 15 years, though I'd only served 14 with good behavior. As they led me away, I turned back to see my family's faces, shocked, heartbroken, but still believing this was all some terrible mistake that would be corrected on appeal. That arrest warrant, folded and creased from being handled so many times, became the first piece of evidence in what would become my obsession with proving my innocence. I kept it in my cell for 14 years, a daily reminder of how quickly truth can be buried under the weight of a system that values convictions over justice. The prison ID card they issued me on my first day became my new identity. Inmate number 47,291. The small plastic rectangle with my mugshot replaced everything I used to be Marcus Williams. Auto mechanic, son, brother, Uncle. Now I was just a number. In orange scrubs, learning that innocence meant nothing behind these walls. Riverside Correctional wasn't the violent hellhole you see in movies, but it wasn't summer camp either. The first lesson came from my cellmate, an older man named Curtis, who'd been inside for 8 years on drug charges. He looked at my ID card and shook his head. First time, huh? Let me guess you're innocent. I am innocent, I said. Probably. Too quickly, too desperately. Curtis laughed, but not unkindly. Son, we're all innocent in here. The guilty ones are walking free while we're locked up for crimes we didn't commit. That's what everybody says. But Curtis taught me the rules that kept you alive. Don't borrow anything you can't pay back. Don't get involved in other people's business. Find a routine and stick to it. Most importantly, don't let them break your spirit. Because once that's gone, you're never getting out heaven. If they open all the doors, I establish my routine quickly. Wake up at 5:30 a.m. for head count. Breakfast at 6:30, usually watery oatmeal, and coffee that tasted like burnt water. Work detail in the laundry from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m., where the industrial washers created a constant rhythm that became the soundtrack to my incarceration. Dinner at 5 p.m., then recreation time until 8:30 p.m. lockdown. The phone calls home were my lifeline those first months. 20 minutes every Tuesday and Thursday, when I could afford the outrageous collect call rates. Mom's voice always sounded strained, like she was trying too hard to be cheerful. How are you holding up, baby? I'm okay, Mom, the lawyer says. The appeal should be filed soon. We're praying for you every day at church. Pastor Williams mentioned you in Sunday service. I didn't tell her that Pastor Williams was probably praying for my soul to find redemption, not for my innocence to be proven. The distinction mattered more than she realized. Jennifer visited every other Sunday for the first year, bringing Tyler when school allowed. Those visits were simultaneously the best and worst parts of my week. Seeing their faces reminded me of what I'd lost, but also why I had to keep fighting. Tyler would press his small hand against the glass partition and tell me about little league and school, normal kid things that felt like stories from another planet. Uncle Marcus, when are you coming home? Jennifer would always jump in before I could answer. Soon, baby. Uncle Marcus will be home soon. But soon kept getting pushed further away. The first appeal was denied. The second appeal was denied. Each rejection letter felt like another nail in the coffin of my former life. I learned to navigate the prison's social hierarchy carefully. The lifers commanded respect because they had nothing to lose. The gang members controlled certain territories and trade routes for contraband. The sex offenders were isolated for their own protection. The mentally ill were largely ignored until they became disruptive. I found my place among the short-timers, guys serving sentences under 20 years, who still believed they'd have lives to return to. We traded stories about the outside world, shared photos of our families, and maintained the fiction that we were just temporarily displaced from our real lives. But prison changes you in ways you don't expect. Your world shrinks to the size of concrete walls and steel bars. You stop noticing the smell of disinfectant and unwashed bodies. You learn to sleep through the constant noise, metal doors slamming, guards' radios crackling, inmates arguing or crying or laughing too loudly. The worst part wasn't the loss of freedom. It was watching the outside world move on without you. Phone calls became shorter, less frequent. Jennifer's visits dropped to once a month, then every other month. Tyler grew taller in increments I could measure between visits, and I realized I was missing his childhood entirely. Year 2 brought the crushing realization that my appeals were going nowhere. My court-appointed appellate attorney was even less engaged than Phelps had been at trial. Form letters, template briefs, no original investigation. I started spending my free time in the law library, teaching myself legal terminology and procedure, where I met Tommy Books Rodriguez, a lifer who'd been studying law for 15 years. Tommy had been convicted of murder in a gang shooting, but unlike most inmates who claimed innocence, Tommy's case had genuine constitutional issues that kept getting overlooked by overworked attorneys. You want to know the truth about justice? Tommy asked me one day, as we sat surrounded by legal texts. Justice is a luxury good. If you can afford the premium version, you get acquitted. If you're stuck with the public defender special, you get convicted. Tommy became my mentor in prison law, teaching me to research cases, draft motions, and understand the appeals process. But more than that, he taught me that maintaining innocence wasn't about convincing other inmates, it was about not letting the system convince you that you deserved to be there. By year 3, my prison ID card had been replaced twice due to normal wear, but I kept the original in my personal property. It reminded me that I wasn't really inmate number 47,291. I was Marcus Williams, and no matter how many years they took from me, they couldn't take away the truth. The stack of returned letters in my cell grew thicker each month. Each envelope stamped with those devastating words, addressee unknown or return to sender. The letters I'd written to Jennifer came back unopened, and with them came the slow, painful realization that my family was erasing me from their lives. It started gradually. Jennifer's visits became sporadic after my 3rd year. She'd make excuses. Styler had a baseball game. She was working double shifts at the hospital. Her car was in the shop. Then the visits stopped altogether. When I called her house, the number was disconnected. When I called the hospital where she worked, they said she'd transferred to a different facility and couldn't provide her new contact information due to privacy policies. I wrote letter after letter to her last known address, pouring my heart onto prison stationery. I told her about the legal research I was doing, the new evidence I was uncovering, how close I felt to proving my innocence. I shared stories about my cellmates, described the small victories of prison life, a good book from the library, a decent meal, a peaceful day without conflict. I asked about Tyler's school, whether he was still playing baseball. If he ever asked about Uncle Marcus, none of those letters ever reached her. They all came back with forwarding stamps and postal markings, creating a paper trail of my family's retreat from my life. I kept every returned envelope, stacking them in a shoebox under my bunk. They became evidence of a different kind of crime, the slow murder of family bonds under the weight of shame and social pressure. Mom tried to maintain contact longer than Jennifer, but even her visits became painful exercises in avoiding reality. She'd sit across from me in the visiting room, her hands folded tightly in her lap, talking about everything except why I was there. Mrs. Johnson from church had her hip replacement. She's doing real well. That's good, Mom. How's Tyler? Her face would tighten slightly. He's fine. Growing like a weed. Does he ever ask about me? Sometimes, but I could see the truth in her eyes. Tyler was learning not to ask about Uncle Marcus. It was easier for everyone if I'd just faded away. Became a family secret that didn't get discussed at dinner tables or family gatherings. The breaking point came during year 4. Mom arrived for her monthly visit looking different, nervous, almost guilty. She wore a new wedding ring. I have something to tell you, Marcus. My stomach dropped before she even spoke. I've been seeing someone. His name is Robert. He's a good man. Been widowed for 3 years. We're thinking about getting married. I wanted to be happy for her. Really? I did. Dad had been gone for 6 years, and Mom deserved companionship, but the way she wouldn't meet my eyes told me there was more. He doesn't know about this situation. He knows I have a son, but he thinks you're just away, working out of state. Away. Like I was on some extended business trip instead of serving time for a crime I didn't commit. Mom, I'm your son. You can't just pretend I don't exist. Tears started rolling down her cheeks. It's not that simple, Marcus. Robert's a deacon at his church. He's very involved in the community. If people knew his wife had a son in prison, Mom, I'm still your son. I'm still your child. But she was already pulling back, both physically and emotionally. I know, baby. I know you are. But this is hard for me too. Every time I come here, every time I see you in those clothes behind that glass, it breaks my heart all over again. That was her last visit. She married Robert 6 months later. I learned about the wedding from a newspaper clipping that somehow made its way to me through another inmate whose sister knew someone who knew someone. No invitation, no phone call, no acknowledgement that her firstborn son existed. The returned letters from Jennifer multiplied. I started writing to other relatives, cousins, aunts, uncles. Most never responded. A few sent brief notes expressing sympathy but making it clear they couldn't maintain contact. The stigma of having a family member in prison was too much for their respectable lives to bear. Tyler's absence hurt most of all. He'd been 12 when I was arrested, old enough to remember our fishing trips and baseball games, but young enough to be molded by adult decisions about who was safe to love. By my 5th year inside, I realized he was probably being told Uncle Marcus was someone they didn't talk about anymore. I started writing letters to Tyler anyway, knowing they'd never reach him but needing to maintain the connection in my own heart. I told him about the books I was reading, the legal cases I was studying, how much I missed teaching him to change a car's oil. I promised him that someday I'd prove my innocence, and we could be family again. Those letters joined the growing stack of returned mail. Each envelope represented another severed connection, another relationship sacrificed to the machinery of mass incarceration. The system didn't just lock up by descent, destroyed families, erased histories, made people disappear from the lives they'd built, but I kept writing. Even when every letter came back undelivered, I kept writing, because giving up on my family meant accepting that Marcus Williams really had died the day they put him in handcuffs. And I wasn't ready to accept that death sentence yet. The returned letters became my motivation to prove my innocence. Not just for myself, but for the possibility that someday my family might want to remember they had a son, a brother, an uncle who never stopped loving them even when they stopped loving him. The law books in Riverside's library became my salvation and my obsession. Thick volumes with cracked spines and yellowed pages, filled with case precedents and legal procedures that offered something my family could no longer provide: hope. I carried those books back to my cell like other inmates carried contraband, studying them under the dim light long after lockdown. Tommy Rodriguez found me there one evening during my 5th year, hunched over a copy of Criminal Procedure, Law, and Practice with a legal pad covered in my messy handwriting. The book was one of dozens I'd checked out over the months, each one teaching me the language of appeals, habeas corpus petitions, and constitutional violations. "You're doing this all wrong," Tommy said, settling into the plastic chair across From my bunk, I looked up from the section on Brady violations I'd been reading for the third time. What do you mean? Tommy had been in Riverside for 15 years, serving life without parole for a murder conviction he'd been fighting since day one. Unlike most lifers who eventually gave up on appeals, Tommy had turned himself into a genuine, legal scholar. Inmates came to him for help with their cases, and even some of the guards respected his knowledge of the law. You're reading like a student cramming for a test, but legal research isn't about memorizing every case. It's about finding the one case that matches your situation exactly. He pulled out a worn notebook filled with his own legal research. Tell me about your trial, not the evidence problems. I explained about the security footage that was never produced, the questionable witness identification, the inadequate legal representation. Tommy listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes in his careful handwriting. Brady violation, potentially ineffective assistance of counsel, and possible prosecutorial misconduct. But you need to prove malicious intent, not just incompetence. He opened one of my law books to a section I'd highlighted weeks earlier. Lewis v. Connecticut, 1985. Prosecutor failed to disclose exculpatory evidence. But here's the key. Need to show the evidence was material to your defense, and that the prosecutor knew it was exculpatory. Over the following months, Tommy became my mentor in jailhouse law. He taught me how to craft legal arguments, how to cite cases properly, how to format briefs that wouldn't be immediately dismissed by overworked appellate courts. More importantly, he taught me to think like a lawyer instead of just an angry, innocent man. Emotion doesn't win appeals. He'd remind me when my writing became too passionate. Facts and law win appeals. Tell your story through the legal framework, not through your broken heart. The prison law library became my office. I'd spend every free hour there, teaching myself about evidence, rules, constitutional law, and criminal procedure. The other inmates started calling me Counselor Williams, half joking but also recognizing that I was becoming something different from the typical inmate. I learned about the Brady rule. Prosecutors must disclose evidence favorable to the defense. I studied ineffective assistance of counsel standards from Strickland v. Washington. I researched witness identification procedures and their reliability problems. Each new case I read felt like finding another key to the lock, keeping me caged. My legal pad filled with notes about other wrongful conviction cases. Men who'd served 20, 30, even 40 years before DNA evidence or prosecutorial misconduct. Revelations set them free. Their stories gave me a roadmap for my own case, but also showed me how long the journey might take. Tommy helped me draft my first serious post-conviction petition in year 6. Unlike the form letters my previous attorneys had filed, this petition was detailed, specific, and grounded in solid legal precedent. We argued ineffective assistance of counsel, prosecutorial misconduct in failing to disclose the security footage, and constitutional violations in the identification procedures. This is good work, Tommy said, as we reviewed the final draft. But you need to understand something. The system doesn't want to admit mistakes. Even when you're right, even when you can prove they violated your rights, they'll fight you every step of the way. He was right. The petition was denied without a hearing. The judge's order was brief and dismissive, essentially saying that my arguments had been waived by not raising them earlier, even though my trial attorney had been incompetent and my appellate attorney had done minimal work. But I didn't give up. I filed another petition, then another. Each one was better researched, better argued, more professionally presented. I was learning not just law, but persistence. Tommy taught me that wrongful conviction cases were wars of attrition. Whoever gave up first lost. The law books became my weapons in this war. I read every criminal procedure case I could find, looking for precedents that might apply to my situation. I studied the rules of evidence, learning how improperly obtained evidence should have been excluded from my trial. I researched prosecutorial ethics violations, building a foundation for future misconduct claims. Other inmates started asking for my help with their cases. I'd review their trial transcripts, help them identify potential appeal issues, draft motions for everything from sentence reductions to medical care. Word spread that Marcus Williams knew law, and suddenly I had a purpose beyond my own case. You're becoming what I became, Tommy observed one day, as I helped another inmate understand why his appeal had been denied. A jailhouse lawyer, someone who helps the system's victims fight back with the system's own rules. The law books represented more than just legal knowledge. They represented the possibility that truth could eventually overcome lies, that justice could eventually overcome convenience, that an innocent man could eventually overcome a corrupt system. Every page I read was an investment in my own freedom, and in the freedom of every other innocent person trapped in these concrete cages. By my 7th year, I'd mastered enough law to be dangerous to the prosecution that had wrongfully convicted me. I just needed to find the right ammunition and the right target. The newspaper clipping arrived in a letter from an old friend of my father's, one of the few people who still occasionally wrote to me. The headline read, "Morrison promoted to police chief after distinguished career," and seeing that name in print made my blood run cold. Detective Ray Morrison, the man who'd arrested me, was now running the entire police department. I stared at Morrison's photograph, older now, gray at the temples, wearing a crisp uniform with more badges and ribbons than I remembered. The article praised his impressive conviction rate and dedication to keeping our community safe. It mentioned several high-profile cases he'd closed, including the swift resolution of the first national bank robbery that had shaken downtown business owners. My case. They were using my wrongful conviction as evidence of Morrison's competence. The article went on to describe Morrison's rise through the ranks, promoted to sergeant 2 years after my conviction, lieutenant 3 years after that, captain by year 8 of my sentence, and now, chief of police. With my case featured prominently in his portfolio of successes, I started researching Morrison's career more systematically, using every resource available in the prison library. Through newspaper archives and public records requests that other inmates helped me file, I began to piece together the trajectory of a man who'd built his reputation on cases like mine. Morrison had joined the force in 1998, fresh out of the police academy with average marks and no particular distinction. For his first decade, he was a patrol officer with an unremarkable record of commendations. No major arrests, no recognition, just another cop doing his job adequately but not exceptionally. Then came 2009, the year he arrested me. Suddenly, Morrison was closing high-profile cases left and right. The bank robbery, a string of burglaries in the wealthy Riverside district, a drug trafficking case that netted several arrests. His clearance rate jumped from average to outstanding almost overnight. The pattern became clear as I read more articles. Morrison had discovered something that would define his career, the value of quick arrests and easy convictions. He didn't solve cases so much as he closed them, often taking the path of least resistance to get suspects into courtrooms and then into prison cells. The promotion to sergeant came with a commendation for outstanding investigative work, leading to multiple felony convictions. The newspaper photo from that ceremony showed Morrison shaking hands with the mayor, both men smiling broadly. The caption mentioned his remarkable ability to bring dangerous criminals to justice quickly and efficiently. What they didn't mention was how many of those dangerous criminals might have been innocent men like me, caught in Morrison's web of ambitious corner-cutting and evidence manipulation. As lieutenant, Morrison's responsibilities expanded to supervising other detectives. This gave him influence over multiple cases simultaneously, and his department's conviction rate continued to climb. He became the go-to detective for cases that needed quick resolution: bank robberies, armed assaults, anything that made headlines and demanded fast action from law enforcement. I found more newspaper coverage from this period, including interviews, where Morrison discussed his proactive approach to criminal investigations. He talked about the importance of following the evidence wherever it leads and ensuring that justice is served for victims of violent crime. The irony of those words, coming from the man who'd buried evidence of my innocence, was almost unbearable. Promotion to captain brought Morrison into the administrative side of law enforcement. He oversaw training programs, implemented new investigative protocols, and represented the department at community meetings. Local business leaders praised his results-oriented approach and his ability to make our streets safer through effective policing. Every promotion, every commendation, every newspaper article praising Morrison's career was built on a foundation that included my wrongful conviction. He'd used my case and probably others like it as stepping stones to climb the ladder of law enforcement success. The most recent articles about Morrison's appointment as chief painted him as a reformer, someone committed to transparency and accountability in modern policing. He talked about implementing new training programs, improving community relations, and ensuring that his department met the highest standards of professional conduct. But I knew the truth about Morrison's standards. I'd experienced firsthand his version of professional conduct, and now he was in charge of an entire police department, with the power to influence investigations, promotions, and policies that would affect countless other potential victims. Reading about Morrison's success while sitting in a prison cell for a crime I didn't commit felt like being slapped repeatedly by the same hand. Every article, every promotion, every public praise for his distinguished service was a reminder of how thoroughly the system had failed me, and how it had rewarded the man responsible for that failure. The newspaper clipping became my motivation to dig deeper into Morrison's methods. If he'd cut corners in my case, if he'd hidden evidence and manipulated witnesses, chances were good that I wasn't his only victim. And if I could prove a pattern of misconduct that might be the key to not only my own freedom but to exposing a corrupt cop who'd climbed to the top of his profession on the backs of innocent people. Morrison's rise to police chief wasn't just a career success story, it was evidence of how broken the system really was, how it rewarded conviction rates over truth, political advancement over justice. But now that I understood the game Morrison had been playing, I could start playing it myself, using his own ambition against him. The security camera log I discovered in year 8 changed everything. Hidden in a stack of police reports that a sympathetic paralegal had obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request. This single document proved what I'd suspected. All along there was evidence that could have cleared me. and Morrison had deliberately concealed it. The log was mundane-looking, just a standard police department evidence inventory form. But buried in the middle of routine entries about fingerprint cards and witness statements was line item number 47, First National Bank security recordings. Multiple angles. March 15, 2009, 1 p.m. to 5 p.m. The entry was signed by Detective R. Morrison and dated March 16, 2009, the day after my arrest. Morrison had the security footage. He'd logged it into evidence, which meant he'd reviewed it, and he'd never turned it over to my defense attorney. Stared at that document for hours, reading and rereading those few typed lines. This wasn't a bureaucratic oversight or a filing error. This was deliberate suppression of exculpatory evidence, a Brady violation that should have resulted in immediate dismissal of all charges against me. The implications hit me like a physical blow. If Morrison had the complete security footage from the bank, he would have seen that I wasn't there during the robbery. He would have known I was innocent before I ever stepped foot in a courtroom. Every day of my imprisonment, every lost relationship, every destroyed dream, all of it was the result of Morrison's conscious decision to hide evidence that would have set me free. I immediately started researching what other evidence might exist. Through Tommy's guidance, I learned how to file more targeted information requests, asking specifically for evidence logs, chain of custody documents, and internal police communications related to my case. What I found was a systematic pattern of evidence manipulation. The grainy photo they'd shown me during interrogation wasn't from the bank's main security camera. It was from a backup system with much lower resolution. The bank manager's deposition, which I finally obtained in year 9, mentioned that the primary security system captured high-definition video from 6 different angles, including one that covered the teller area where the robbery occurred. Our main system records everything in 1080p. The bank manager had testified during a pretrial hearing I'd never been told about. We have cameras covering every customer area, every teller station, and both entrances. The system runs 24/7 and stores footage for 90 days. 90 days. The footage would have been available for 3 months after the robbery, plenty of time for a thorough investigation. But my trial didn't begin until 4 months after my arrest. Conveniently after the automatic deletion period for the security recordings, the cover-up went deeper than I'd imagined. Internal police memos obtained through another FOIA request showed that Morrison had specifically requested the security footage be secured pending further investigation, but instead of turning it over to prosecutors, as required by Brady rules, he'd filed it away and let it disappear into the evidence storage system. Even more damning was a memo dated 1 week before my trial. A prosecutor had requested all evidence related to my case, specifically mentioning security recordings. Morrison's response was a masterpiece of bureaucratic deception. All available evidence has been provided to defense counsel per discovery requirements. The word available was doing a lot of work in that sentence. Technically, Morrison wasn't lying. He'd made the evidence unavailable by hiding it, then claimed he'd provided everything that was available. It was the kind of semantic game that protected him legally while completely violating the spirit of due process. I found similar patterns in the witness testimony. The 3 bank customers who'd identified me in the lineup had initially given descriptions that didn't match my appearance. One described the robber as significantly taller than me. Another said he had a beard, which I'd never worn. The third mentioned a distinctive scar on the suspect's neck that I didn't have, but by the time they testified at trial, their descriptions had mysteriously aligned with my physical characteristics. Morrison's interview notes showed he'd met with each witness multiple times, ostensibly to clarify their recollections. What really happened was witness coaching, guiding their memories toward identifying me instead of the actual perpetrator. The evidence log became my smoking gun, but it was also my roadmap to uncovering Morrison's entire system of misconduct. If he'd done this to me, he'd probably done it to others. If he'd hidden evidence in my case, he'd likely hidden evidence in other cases. And if he'd coached witnesses to identify innocent suspects, he'd turned evidence manipulation into an art form. Tommy helped me understand the legal significance of what I'd found. This isn't just prosecutorial misconduct, he said, studying the documents I'd spread across our table in the law library. This is criminal conspiracy. Morrison didn't just fail to disclose evidence, he actively concealed it while knowing it would exonerate you. The security camera log represented more than just evidence of my innocence, it was proof of Morrison's guilt. Every day he'd hidden that footage was another day he'd knowingly kept an innocent man in prison. Every promotion he'd received based on his conviction rate was stolen from the truth he'd buried. I started drafting a new habeas corpus petition, this time with the evidence log as the centerpiece. But I also began thinking bigger. If Morrison had built his career on cases like mine, then exposing him wouldn't just free me, might free others who'd been caught in his web of ambition and corruption. The evidence was there, hidden in plain sight within the bureaucratic maze of police paperwork. All I had to do was prove that Morrison had deliberately concealed it, and his entire house of cards would come tumbling down. The rejection letters came in waves, each one a small death to the hope I'd been carefully nurturing since discovering the security camera log. I'd written to every innocence organization I could find, the Innocence Project, the National Registry of Exonerations, the Mid-Atlantic Innocence Project, regional organizations in 12 different states. The form letters that came back were polite, but devastating in their uniformity. Thank you for contacting the Innocence Project. Unfortunately, due to our limited resources and overwhelming caseload, we are unable to accept your case for review. At this time, we receive thousands of requests annually and can only assist a small percentage of applicants. I kept every rejection letter in a manila folder that grew thicker each month. Each one represented another door slammed shut, another organization that couldn't or wouldn't help me fight the system that had destroyed my life. But I kept writing. Because the alternative was accepting that I'd die in prison for Morrison's crimes. The Innocence Project's rejections stung the most because they were the gold standard. The organization that had freed hundreds of wrongfully convicted people through DNA testing and legal advocacy. Their form letter explained that they prioritized cases with biological evidence available for testing, cases where DNA could definitively prove innocence. My case had no biological evidence. Bank robberies rarely leave DNA traces, especially when the perpetrator wears gloves and doesn't physically assault anyone. The evidence of my innocence wasn't in a test tube, it was in the security footage Morrison had hidden, and the pattern of misconduct I was slowly documenting. Wrote more detailed letters to smaller organizations, explaining the evidence suppression, the witness coaching, the systematic corruption that had led to my conviction. Most never responded. Those that did sent variations of the same message: limited resources, overwhelming demand, inability to take on new cases without clear DNA evidence, or obvious constitutional violations. But constitutional violations were exactly what I had. Morrison's deliberate concealment of exculpatory evidence was a textbook Brady violation. The ineffective assistance of my trial counsel was clear from the record. The problematic witness identification procedures violated established precedent. Yet none of the innocence organizations seemed interested in cases that required actual investigation rather than just laboratory analysis. The Mid-Atlantic Innocence Project sent a slightly more encouraging response. While we cannot accept your case for full representation, we encourage you to continue pursuing post-conviction remedies through the courts. Your case appears to raise legitimate constitutional issues that merit judicial review. Legitimate constitutional issues that merit judicial review. Translation: you're probably right. But we can't help you prove it. I started reaching out to law school innocence clinics, thinking that student lawyers supervised by professors might have more time to investigate complex cases. The responses were equally disappointing. Most clinics only worked on cases referred by established innocence organizations, creating a circular system where you needed help to get help. The University of Virginia Innocence Project Clinic sent a detailed rejection that was almost worse than the form letters. A third-year law student had actually reviewed my materials and concluded that while my case presented interesting legal questions, they couldn't take it on because resource constraints require us to focus on cases with the highest probability of successful resolution. Highest probability of successful resolution. My case was too hard, too complicated, too risky for organizations supposedly dedicated to freeing innocent people. But in year 10, something changed. A paralegal named Maria Santos from the Pennsylvania Innocence Project wrote me a personal letter instead of a form rejection. She'd read my entire submission package, the evidence logs, the witness testimony analysis, the internal police memos I'd obtained through FOIA requests. Mr. Williams, her letter began, while we cannot take your case for full representation, I believe your research has uncovered significant evidence of prosecutorial misconduct. I'm forwarding your materials to several attorneys who specialize in police misconduct cases. One of them may be interested in reviewing your situation. It wasn't acceptance, but it was hope. Someone with legal training had looked at my evidence and seen what I'd been seeing, a pattern of deliberate misconduct that went far beyond simple incompetence or oversight. Maria's letter also included practical advice that none of the other organizations had offered. She suggested specific legal databases I could access through the prison library, particular cases I should research for precedent, and strategic approaches for presenting my evidence in court filings. Focus on building a timeline of Morrison's conduct across multiple cases, she wrote. If you can establish a pattern of evidence suppression, it strengthens your individual claims significantly. Prosecutors and judges are more likely to believe systematic misconduct than isolated incidents. I followed her advice, expanding my research beyond my own case. Using the limited internet access available through the prison education program, I started searching for other cases Morrison had worked, other convictions he'd secured through questionable methods. What I found was disturbing. Morrison's name appeared on dozens of cases over his career, many involving the same problematic patterns I'd identified in my own conviction. Witnesses who changed their stories after multiple interviews, evidence that disappeared or was never disclosed to defense attorneys, defendants who pled guilty rather than risk trial with overwhelming circumstantial evidence. The rejection letters from innocence organizations became motivation rather than discouragement. If the established system wouldn't help me, I'd build my own case from the ground up. I'd become my own innocence project, my own investigative team, my own legal advocate. But Maria's letter had given me something more valuable than hope. It had given me direction. Someone trained in the law had validated my research and pointed me toward a path that might actually lead to freedom. The rejection letters represented closed doors, but Maria's letter had opened a window. I kept writing to attorneys who specialized in police misconduct, civil rights violations, and wrongful conviction cases. Most still said no, but now I had better materials to send them, more compelling evidence to present, and a clearer understanding of how to frame my case in legal terms that lawyers would recognize and respect. The stack of rejection letters remained on my desk as a reminder of how difficult this fight would be, but next to them sat Maria's letter, proof that someone believed my evidence was worth pursuing. Sometimes that's all an innocent man needs, one person willing to say that his fight for justice matters. The DNA test results arrived on a Tuesday morning in year 12, delivered by a guard who had no idea he was carrying my liberation in a manila envelope. The laboratory report from Orchid Cellmark looked official and clinical, filled with scientific terminology and genetic markers that I barely understood, but the conclusion was written in plain English that changed everything. The DNA profile obtained from evidence item number 23 excludes Marcus Williams as a contributor. I read those words over and over, my hands shaking as I held the document. 12 years after my conviction, science had finally proven what I'd been screaming from the beginning. I was innocent. The DNA found on the money bag from the bank robbery belonged to someone else entirely. Someone whose genetic profile was already in the system under the name Carlos Mendez, a career criminal with a string of armed robbery convictions. The road to this moment had been longer and more complicated than I'd ever imagined. It started when Sarah Chen, a civil rights attorney from Philadelphia, finally agreed to take my case after receiving Maria Santos's referral. Sarah specialized in police misconduct cases and had a reputation for taking on seemingly impossible fights against corrupt law enforcement. Our first meeting in the prison consultation room was unlike any legal conversation I'd had in 12 years. Sarah didn't dismiss my evidence or talk down to me like I was just another inmate with a conspiracy theory. She listened carefully as I explained Morrison's pattern of evidence suppression, took detailed notes about the security footage he'd hidden, and asked probing questions that showed she understood both the legal and practical implications of what I'd uncovered. The evidence suppression is strong, she said after reviewing my research, but Brady violations are notoriously difficult to prove unless you can show deliberate intent. We need something more definitive. That something turned out to be DNA testing technology that hadn't existed when I was convicted in 2009. Sarah filed a motion for post-conviction DNA testing, arguing that biological evidence from the crime scene had never been properly analyzed. The prosecution initially fought the request, claiming that DNA testing was unnecessary given the overwhelming evidence of my guilt. But Sarah had done her homework. She'd researched every aspect of my case, interviewed the original witnesses, and discovered discrepancies in their testimony that my trial attorney had missed. More importantly, she'd found evidence that the money bag used in the robbery had been handled by the perpetrator without gloves, potentially leaving behind skin cells that could yield a DNA profile. The judge who granted the DNA testing motion was the Honorable Patricia Williams, no relation, despite sharing my last name. Judge Williams had a reputation for being thorough and fair, willing to consider new evidence even in old cases. Her order granting the motion was careful and detailed, acknowledging both the prosecution's concerns about reopening closed cases and the constitutional requirement that innocent people not be kept in prison, while the court recognizes the finality interests in criminal convictions. Judge Williams wrote, "The interests of justice require that newly available scientific evidence be considered when it might establish a defendant's innocence." The DNA testing process took 8 months, during which I lived in a state of suspended animation between hope and despair. Every day brought the possibility that science would vindicate me, but also the possibility that the test would be inconclusive or somehow support the prosecution's case. Sarah kept me informed throughout the process, explaining each step and managing my expectations. DNA testing isn't magic, she warned me. Even if we get a profile that excludes you, the prosecution might argue that multiple people were involved in the robbery, or that the DNA is from innocent contamination. But when the results came back, they were unambiguous. Not only did the DNA exclude me completely, but it matched Carlos Mendez, whose criminal history included 3 previous bank robberies using identical methods. The genetic evidence didn't just prove my innocence, it said identified the actual perpetrator. The phone call from Sarah came at 2:30 p.m. on that Tuesday, during the recreation period when inmates were allowed to use the phones. Her voice was barely controlled excitement as she read me the laboratory report over the crackling connection. "Marcus, you need to sit down. The DNA results exclude you completely and match a known offender named Carlos Mendez. We're filing for immediate exoneration." I couldn't speak for several seconds. After 12 years of fighting, 12 years of being told I was lying about my innocence, 12 years of watching my life disappear behind prison walls, science had finally spoken the truth I'd been carrying all along. What happens now? I managed to ask. Now we prove that Morrison knew about this all along. The DNA profile was in the system when you were convicted. A competent investigation would have run the evidence against the database and identified Mendez as a suspect. The fact that this wasn't done suggests either incredible incompetence or deliberate misconduct. The DNA test results became more than just proof of my innocence, they became evidence of Morrison's corruption. Sarah's investigation revealed that Mendez had been arrested for a similar bank robbery just 3 weeks before my case. But Morrison had never cross-referenced the cases or compared the methods used. The laboratory report sat on my desk like a holy relic, scientific proof that I'd been telling the truth for 12 years. But more than that, it was ammunition for the war I was about to wage against the system that had stolen my life and the man who had orchestrated that theft. Carlos Mendez was serving time in a different state for his other robberies, completely unaware that his DNA had just freed an innocent man and destroyed a corrupt cop's career. The genetic evidence that cleared me would soon become the foundation for everything that followed the lawsuit. The exposure of Morrison's misconduct, and the beginning of real justice. The exoneration certificate felt impossibly light in my hands. Just a single sheet of official paper that somehow erased 14 years of wrongful imprisonment. Judge Williams had signed it that morning after a brief hearing where the prosecution formally moved to dismiss all charges against me. The document bore the official seal of the court and language that should have been triumphant. The conviction of Marcus Williams is hereby vacated and all charges dismissed, in the interest of justice. But standing outside Riverside Correctional Facility at 3:47 p.m. on September 23, 2023, holding that certificate while wearing the same clothes I'd been arrested in 14 years earlier, freedom felt more like exile than liberation. The world had changed in ways I couldn't have imagined. The parking lot where my mother used to park her 1998 Honda Civic was now filled with vehicles. I didn't recognize cars that seemed to drive themselves. Trucks that were silent despite their size, everything connected to some invisible network that made the air itself feel different. Sarah Chen stood beside me, holding a folder thick with legal documents and a phone that looked more like a computer than anything I remembered. She'd been explaining practical matters, where I would stay initially, how to get identification updated, what services were available for exonerees, but her words sounded distant and hollow. "Marcus, are you listening?" she asked gently. I nodded, though I hadn't absorbed anything she'd said. I was too busy staring at the people walking past us on the sidewalk, every one of them holding small rectangular devices, talking to them, or staring at screens that glowed with impossible clarity. The world had become science fiction while I'd been locked away. "The halfway house will provide temporary housing while we work on getting you settled," Sarah continued. "I know it's not ideal, but the state doesn't have specific programs for exonerees. Technically, you're being processed the same as any other released inmate." The irony wasn't lost on me. After 14 years of wrongful imprisonment, the state was treating my release exactly like they'd treat the release of an actual criminal. No apology, no acknowledgement of the injustice, no recognition that they'd stolen the prime years of an innocent man's life. The halfway house was a converted motel in a part of town I didn't recognize, surrounded by businesses that hadn't existed. When I was arrested, Sarah drove me there in her car, which started without a key, and spoke to her in a woman's voice about traffic conditions and navigation routes. I sat in the passenger seat, overwhelmed by how smooth and quiet everything felt compared to my memories of vehicles from 2009. My room at the halfway house was smaller than my prison cell, furnished with a narrow bed, a plastic chair, and a desk that looked like it had been salvaged from a 1980s office building. The window overlooked a parking lot where people charged their cars by plugging them into posts like giant phone chargers. The other residents were recently released inmates, men who'd served their time and were transitioning back to society, but their transition was different from mine. They were guilty of their crimes, had accepted responsibility, and were genuinely trying to rebuild their lives after paying their debt to society. I was an innocent man who owed society nothing, but was somehow expected to be grateful for my freedom. That first night, lying on the thin mattress and staring at the ceiling, I couldn't sleep. The silence was wrong. No constant noise of 300 men breathing, snoring, talking, crying, no metal doors slamming, no guard radios crackling, no institutional sounds that had become the soundtrack to my adult life. The freedom I'd dreamed, well, for 14 years felt more like sensory deprivation. I pulled out the exoneration certificate and read it again by the light of a street lamp outside my window. The legal language was precise and final. Conviction vacated, charges dismissed, slate wiped clean. But no amount of legal terminology could give me back my 20s and 30s, couldn't restore my relationship with my family, couldn't return the career I'd been building before Morrison destroyed my life. The certificate represented vindication, but it also represented everything I'd lost while fighting for that vindication. 14 years of relationships, experiences, opportunities, and simple human moments that could never be recovered or replaced. The document in my hands was simultaneously the most important paper I'd ever held and the most insufficient compensation imaginable. I thought about calling my family, but realized I didn't have current phone numbers for any of them. Jennifer had moved multiple times during my incarceration. Mom was living with her new husband in a house I'd never seen. Tyler was now 26 years old, a grown man who'd lived more of his life without knowing me than with knowing me. Finally came near dawn, filled with dreams where I was still in prison, where the exoneration certificate was just another cruel fantasy my mind had created to torture me with false hope. I woke up several times, confused about where I was, reaching for the concrete wall that should have been next to my bunk. The certificate sat on the plastic desk, catching the morning light that streamed through the thin curtains. Freedom was supposed to feel triumphant, liberating, joyful. Instead, it felt like stepping off a cliff into empty air, not knowing where I would land or how far I would fall. But it was freedom, however complicated and bittersweet, and it was the first step toward making Morrison pay for what he'd done, not just to me, but to everyone whose life he'd destroyed in service of his own ambition. The exoneration certificate was my proof of innocence, but it would also become my license to pursue justice. The job rejection letter from AutoZone arrived 3 weeks after my release, typed on corporate letterhead with language that was polite but devastating. While we appreciate your interest in employment opportunities with AutoZone, we regret to inform you that we cannot move forward with your application due to significant gaps in your employment history. I stared at the letter in my cramped halfway house room, holding my exoneration certificate in my other hand. 14 years of wrongful imprisonment had created an employment gap that made me unemployable, even though I'd been cleared of all charges and proven innocent through DNA evidence. The corporate hiring system didn't have a checkbox for wrongfully convicted, so I was treated the same as someone who'd simply chosen not to work for over a decade. This was the 5th rejection letter I'd received in 2 weeks. Walmart, Home Depot, McDonald's, Taco Bell. Every employer I'd applied to had the same response. My resume showed automotive repair experience from 2001 to 2009. Then nothing until 2023. When applications asked about gaps in employment, what was I supposed to write? Imprisoned for crime I didn't commit. Victim of prosecutorial misconduct. Busy proving my innocence while the real criminal walked free. The technology barriers were almost as frustrating as the employment discrimination. Every job application had to be completed online using systems that hadn't existed when I was arrested. Smartphones were required for 2-factor authentication, email verification, and even basic communication with potential employers. The flip phone Sarah had helped me get through a program for indigent. Defendants couldn't access websites or download apps. I spent hours at the public library, trying to navigate job search websites on computers that seemed designed by aliens. Multiple tabs, drop-down menus, file uploads, password requirements, with special characters, simple tasks that everyone else took for granted, became complex puzzles that left me feeling stupid and defeated. The library became my second home, not just for job searching but for basic digital literacy. YouTube tutorials taught me about social media, online banking, and the countless apps that apparently controlled every aspect of modern life. I watched videos about Uber, DoorDash, Amazon Prime, and Netflix, trying to understand how society functioned in 2023, but the learning curve was steep and humiliating. A teenager helping me set up an email account grew impatient when I couldn't understand why my password needed to include numbers, capital letters, and symbols. "It's not that hard," she muttered, typing rapidly on a keyboard that felt foreign under my fingers. Everything cost money I didn't have. An apartment required first month's rent, last month's rent, and a security deposit typically $3,000 or more. But I couldn't get an apartment without proof of income, and I couldn't get income without an address. That wasn't a halfway house. The circular logic of modern life trapped people like me in perpetual poverty. The state of Pennsylvania provided exactly $50 in compensation for my wrongful conviction, 10 cents for each day I'd been imprisoned. $50 to rebuild a life that had been completely destroyed by government misconduct. I spent most of it on bus fare to job interviews that led nowhere. Social Security became another nightmare. My account had been suspended during my imprisonment, and reactivating it required documentation I didn't have, an appointment set, offices that were only open during hours when I was supposed to be job hunting. The bureaucracy seemed designed to prevent people from accessing the benefits they'd paid into. Healthcare was non-existent. The Affordable Care Act had created insurance marketplaces I didn't understand, with premiums I couldn't afford and deductibles that made coverage meaningless even if I could somehow qualify. My 14 years in prison had left me with dental problems, vision issues, and joint pain that went untreated. Because emergency rooms don't provide routine care, the halfway house had a 10 p.m. curfew and required residents to attend weekly group meetings where counselors discussed reintegration strategies and avoiding recidivism. I sat through sessions designed for actual criminals, listening to advice about staying away from criminal associates and avoiding situations that lead to re-offending. The counselors meant well, but they couldn't understand that my only crime had been being in the wrong place at the wrong time when Morrison needed a quick arrest. Other residents were kind but couldn't relate to my situation. James had served 6 years for armed robbery and was genuinely trying to change his life. Miguel had done 8 years for drug dealing and talked about the temptation to return to his old neighborhood. Their struggles were real and valid, but they were also fundamentally different from mine. They were rebuilding lives they'd chosen to destroy. I was building a life from scratch after having it stolen. The rejection letter from AutoZone joined the growing stack on my desk. Each one represented another door slammed shut, another employer who saw my 14-year gap and decided I wasn't worth the risk. The automotive skills I'd developed before my arrest were probably obsolete anyway. Cars had become computers on wheels, requiring diagnostic equipment and software knowledge I'd never had the chance to learn. At night, I'd lie awake calculating how long I could survive on the dwindling assistance money. The halfway house provided temporary shelter, but it wasn't a long-term solution. I needed income, housing, healthcare, and basic integration into a society that had moved on without me, but every system seemed designed to keep people like me trapped in poverty and dependence. The job rejection letters weren't just employment problems. They were evidence of how society punishes innocent people for the crimes committed against them. Morrison had stolen my freedom for 14 years, but the aftermath of that theft was stealing my future indefinitely. The exoneration certificate that had seemed so important in court was meaningless to employers who saw only risk where there should have been compensation. The internal police memo that Sarah discovered buried in hundreds of pages of case files was dated March 18, 2009, 3 days after my arrest. Detective Morrison's handwriting was barely legible, but the typed summary underneath was crystal clear. Security footage from First National Bank to be misfiled pending further investigation. Material may complicate prosecution timeline. File under miscellaneous evidence and active cases. I held the document with trembling hands, reading those words over and over while sitting in Sarah's law office. This wasn't prosecutorial oversight or bureaucratic incompetence. This was criminal conspiracy. Morrison had deliberately hidden evidence that would have proven my innocence. Ben covered his tracks by misfiling it in a section of the evidence room where it would never be found. During normal discovery procedures, "This is our smoking gun," Sarah said, spreading additional documents across her conference table. "But it's also just the beginning. If Morrison was willing to frame you for a crime you didn't commit, we need to find out who else he destroyed." Sarah had spent the 3 months since my exoneration conducting her own investigation into Morrison's career, using Freedom of Information Act requests, subpoenas, and old-fashioned detective work to uncover a pattern of misconduct that spanned the entire time on the force. What she'd found was a systematic campaign of evidence manipulation, witness coaching, and prosecutorial corruption that had sent dozens of innocent people to prison. The memo about misfiling my security footage was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. Sarah showed me Morrison's case files from his years as a detective, highlighting patterns that emerged once you knew what to look for. Witnesses who changed their testimony after multiple interviews with Morrison, evidence that disappeared from crime scenes or was never logged properly, defendants who pled guilty to reduced charges rather than risk trial against overwhelming circumstantial evidence. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to a case from 2011. Daniel Rodriguez, arrested for armed assault. 3 witnesses initially said the attacker was taller and heavier than Rodriguez, but by trial, all 3 identified Rodriguez as the perpetrator. Morrison interviewed each witness at least 4 times before trial. The Rodriguez case followed the same template as mine: questionable witness identification, missing evidence, and a defendant who maintained his innocence despite pressure to accept a plea deal. Rodriguez had served 8 years before being paroled, still proclaiming his innocence to anyone who would listen. I found similar patterns in case after case. Morrison had perfected a system of manufacturing convictions by controlling the evidence narrative. He'd coach witnesses to align their testimony with his theory of the case, suppress evidence that contradicted his conclusions, and present circumstantial evidence as definitive proof of guilt. The most disturbing discovery was how Morrison's superiors had enabled his misconduct. Internal affairs complaints about evidence handling irregularities were dismissed without investigation. Prosecutors who questioned Morrison's methods were reassigned to other departments. Defense attorneys who challenged his testimony were quietly blacklisted for major cases. Sarah had interviewed former colleagues who described Morrison as results-oriented and willing to do whatever it took to close cases. What they were really describing was a corrupt cop who valued conviction rates over justice, career advancement over constitutional rights. The department knew, Sarah told me, reviewing personnel files she'd obtained through litigation. Morrison's clearance rate was statistically impossible without cutting corners. Good detectives solve maybe 60% of their cases. Morrison was claiming 90% clearance rates year after year. The evidence manipulation went beyond simple misconduct. It was systematic fraud perpetrated with the knowledge and tacit approval of his supervisors. Every promotion Morrison received was based partly on conviction rates that he'd achieved. Through criminal means, every commendation, every public praise, every career advancement was built on the destruction of innocent lives. But the cover-up extended even deeper. Sarah discovered that Morrison had allies in the prosecutor's office, who helped bury exculpatory evidence and coached witnesses to support his false narratives. Assistant District Attorney Patricia Wells had worked with Morrison on over 30 cases, and her conviction rate was almost as suspiciously high as his clearance rate. Wells knew about the evidence suppression, Sarah explained, showing me email exchanges between Morrison and the prosecutor's office. Look at this message from 2010. Evidence review complete. Nothing beneficial to defense identified, but the evidence logs show multiple items that were never disclosed. The conspiracy involved not just Morrison, but an entire network of law enforcement and prosecution officials who prioritized statistics over justice. They'd created a pipeline for wrongful convictions, feeding innocent people into the prison system to maintain their reputations as toughened crime professionals. I thought about all the other Marcus Williams sitting in prison cells, maintaining their innocence while their families slowly gave up hope. How many Daniel Rodriguez cases were there? How many lives had Morrison destroyed in service of his own ambition? The internal memo about misfiling my evidence was more than just proof of Morrison's guilt. It was evidence of institutional corruption that reached every level of the criminal justice system. But it was also our roadmap for exposing the entire conspiracy and freeing everyone who'd been caught in Morrison's web of lies. Sarah was already preparing civil rights lawsuits against not just Morrison, but the police department, the prosecutor's office, and every official who'd enabled his misconduct. The memo would be our primary evidence, but the pattern of corruption we'd uncovered would be our weapon for dismantling the entire system that had failed so many innocent people. We're not just seeking justice for you, Sarah told me as we reviewed the evidence spread across her conference table. We're going to expose everyone who helped Morrison frame innocent people, and we're going to make sure this never happens to anyone else. The family photo I'd carried throughout my imprisonment was creased and faded from years of handling, but the faces were still Claire, Mom, Jennifer, Tyler, and me at a backyard barbecue in 2008. All of us laughing at something Tyler had said, while holding a baseball bat that was almost as tall as he was. I stared at that picture sitting in Sarah's office, gathering courage for the conversation I'd been avoiding since my release 6 months earlier. You don't have to do this, Sarah said gently. Sometimes families need more time to process what happened, but I needed to try. The DNA evidence had proven my innocence to the world, but my family had lived with the shame and doubt of having a convicted felon in their midst for 14 years. They'd built new lives around my absence, created new identities that didn't include the son, brother, and uncle they'd lost to the system. I couldn't force them to include me again, but I owed it to myself and to the man in that old photograph to at least try. Jennifer's address came from a private investigator Sarah had hired. She was living in suburban Atlanta now, married to a man named David Chuno, relation to Sirand, working as a pediatric nurse at Children's Healthcare. She had 2 daughters, ages 8 and 10, who had no idea they had an uncle who'd spent their entire lives in prison for a crime he didn't commit. I called first, using the number the investigator had provided. The phone rang 4 times before a woman's voice answered, dolder than I remembered, but unmistakably Jennifer. Hello, Jen, it's Marcus. The silence stretched so long I thought she'd hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. Marcus, is this are you? I'm out, Jen. I was exonerated. DNA evidence proved I was innocent. Another long pause. I could hear children laughing in the background, the sound of a normal family living a normal life. I saw it on the news. She said, finally. I wasn't sure if I should. I didn't know if you'd want to hear from us. Us. The word hit me like a physical blow. There was an us that didn't include me, a family unit that had formed in my absence and might not have room for the brother who'd been erased from their lives. I'd like to see you, I said, if that's okay. I know it's been a long time. It has been a long time. Her voice carried 14 years of pain, guilt, and complicated emotions I couldn't fully understand. Marcus, I need you to know we thought the evidence seemed so. You thought I was guilty. The lawyers said the case was strong. The witnesses identified you. We wanted to believe you, but it was easier to believe I was guilty than to believe the system was wrong. The accusation hung between us through the phone line. I hadn't meant to sound bitter, but 14 years of abandonment had created wounds that wouldn't heal just because DNA had vindicated me. It wasn't easier, Jennifer said, and I could hear tears in her voice. It was never easier. Do you think it was easy to tell my daughters that Mommy's brother was in prison? Do you think it was easy to change my name when I got married so people wouldn't connect me to your case? She'd changed her name. Jennifer Williams had become Jennifer Chen, erasing even the family connection that might have reminded people she had a brother who'd been convicted of armed robbery. I want to see Tyler, I said. He's a man now. He can make his own decisions about whether to have a relationship with his uncle. Tyler doesn't know, Jennifer said quietly. Doesn't know what about you? About any of this. He was so young when you were arrested, and after a few years, it seemed kinder to let him forget. He knows Mom had another son who died when he was little. It seemed easier than explaining that his uncle was in prison, died. She'd told Tyler I was dead rather than admitting I was innocent and imprisoned. In Jennifer's version of family history, Marcus Williams had never existed, or had existed so briefly that his absence didn't require explanation. I'm not dead, Jen. I know that. I know that now. But for 14 years, you might as well have been. We grieved you, Marcus. We mourned you like you'd died in that courtroom when the jury said guilty. The pain in her voice was real, but so was mine. They'd chosen to believe I was dead rather than fight for my innocence. They'd chosen comfort over truth, social acceptability, over family loyalty. I'd like to meet David, I said, and the girls. I'm their uncle, whether they know it or not. Marcus, please. You have to understand David doesn't know about you either. He knows I had a brother who died young, but not the rest of it. If I tell him now, if I tell the girls what you're ashamed of me, I'm ashamed of us. The words exploded out of her, raw and honest. I'm ashamed that we gave up on you. I'm ashamed that we chose our reputation over your innocence. I'm ashamed that I let my daughters grow up without knowing their uncle because I was too cowardly to defend you. The admission hung between us, painful, but necessary. Jennifer had carried her own burden for 14 years, the knowledge that she'd abandoned her brother when he needed her most. The guilt of choosing social convenience over family loyalty. The man in this photo, I said, looking at the creased family picture, he wouldn't have given up on you. I know, she whispered. That man was better than us. That's why losing him hurt so much. We talked for another hour, crying and arguing, and trying to bridge 14 years of separation with words that felt inadequate for the task. Jennifer agreed to meet me, but asked for time to figure out how to tell her family that the brother she'd buried was actually alive and innocent. The family photo represented everything I'd lost and everything I was trying to reclaim. The people in that picture had loved each other completely, without reservation or shame. But those people were gone, replaced by strangers who shared DNA but not trust, history but not hope. Rebuilding my family would be harder than proving my innocence had been. DNA could establish genetic truth, but it couldn't restore emotional bonds that had been severed by fear, doubt, and time. The photo on my desk was evidence of what we'd once been, but it couldn't guarantee what we might become again. The TV interview transcript that Sarah handed me was 15 pages of my own words, but reading them felt like watching someone else's life unfold on paper. Channel 6 News had aired my interview the previous week, and the response had been overwhelming, of social media comments, dozens of interview requests, and a flood of attention that made my quiet struggle for justice suddenly very public. Mr. Williams, let's start at the beginning. You were convicted of armed robbery in 2009 and served 14 years before being exonerated. How does it feel to finally have your innocence proven? Reading my response on the transcript, I remembered how surreal it had felt sitting under those bright studio lights, knowing that millions of people would hear my story. I'd worn the only decent shirt I owned, a button-down that Sarah had bought for me because my prison-issue clothes weren't suitable for television. It feels like waking up from a nightmare, except the nightmare was real and it lasted 14 years. DNA evidence proved what I'd been saying all along. I was innocent. But proving innocence and getting justice are two different things. The interviewer, Linda Morisano, relation to Detective Morrison, thank God had done her homework. She'd reviewed court documents, spoken with Sarah about the legal implications, and asked questions that got to the heart of what had gone wrong with my case. The DNA evidence not only cleared you, but identified the actual perpetrator, Carlos Mendez, who was already in the system for similar crimes. Why wasn't this connection made during the original investigation? On the transcript, I could see where I'd paused before answering, choosing my words carefully because I knew they would be used against me in future legal proceedings. That's exactly what we're investigating. Detective Ray Morrison, who is now the police chief, was responsible for the investigation. Either he failed to run basic database searches that would have identified the real perpetrator, or he deliberately chose not to pursue evidence that would have contradicted his theory of the case. The interview had generated intense public reaction. Social media exploded with support for my case, but also with skepticism from people who couldn't believe the police would deliberately frame an innocent man. The hashtag Justice for Marcus started trending locally, while hashtag fake exoneration gained traction among people who believed I was manipulating the system. Reading the transcript now, I could see how carefully Linda had balanced the story. She'd presented the facts of my case objectively, but also included the police department's response, a brief statement, saying they couldn't comment on ongoing litigation, but maintained that the original investigation had followed proper procedures. Let's talk about Detective Morrison, who is now Police Chief Morrison. What do you want people to know about his role in your wrongful conviction? I want people to know that Morrison didn't just fail to solve this case properly, he actively suppressed evidence that would have proven my innocence. We have internal police memos showing that he deliberately hid security footage from the bank, This wasn't incompetence, this was conspiracy. The accusation had been carefully reviewed by Sarah before the interview. We had documentation to support every claim, but calling the police chief a criminal conspirator on television was still risky. Morrison's lawyers had already threatened to sue me for defamation, which was rich considering he'd stolen 14 years of my life. The public response had been divided but passionate. Supporters organized rallies demanding Morrison's resignation and calling for a full investigation into other cases he'd handled. Critics accused me of being a career criminal, trying to cash in on technicalities and DNA evidence they didn't fully understand. Local talk radio had become a battleground over my case. Conservative hosts questioned whether I was really innocent or just benefiting from liberal prosecutors who were soft on crime. Progressive hosts used my story to criticize systemic problems with police accountability and prosecutorial misconduct. The transcript captured the moment when Linda asked the question I'd been dreading. What do you say to people who wonder why your own family abandoned you during your imprisonment? I say that Morrison didn't just rob that bank, he robbed me of my family. When police and prosecutors frame an innocent person, they don't just destroy one life, they destroy entire families. My sister, my mother, my nephew, they were all victims of Morrison's misconduct too. It was a diplomatic answer that avoided discussing the painful reality of my family's abandonment. I couldn't explain on television that Jennifer had told her children I was dead, or that my mother had remarried and erased me from her new life. Some truths were too personal for public consumption. The interview had generated leads from other potential victims of Morrison's misconduct. 3 men had contacted Sarah's office, claiming they'd been wrongfully convicted in cases Morrison had investigated. 2 women said their brothers were serving time for crimes they insisted they didn't commit, all based on investigations. Morrison had lead Mr. Williams. You're suing the city for $30 million. Some people say that's excessive. What's your response? $30 million works out to about $2 million per year of wrongful imprisonment. How much would you charge? For 14 years of your life? How much compensation would be appropriate for having your family destroyed, your career ruined, your reputation shattered, and your freedom stolen by government officials who knew you were innocent? The interview had made Morrison's misconduct a public issue rather than just a legal matter. Citizens were demanding accountability from their police department, and city council members were calling for independent investigations. The transcript represented my first opportunity to tell my story in my own words, without lawyers filtering my message or prosecutors distorting my truth. But media attention was a double-edged sword. The more public my case became, the more pressure there was on Morrison to fight back. His career and reputation were now tied to maintaining that my conviction had been legitimate, even in the face of DNA evidence proving otherwise. The TV interview transcripts sat on my desk next to legal briefs and court documents, representing a different kind of evidence, the power of public opinion in the fight for justice. Sometimes the court of public opinion moved faster than actual courts, and sometimes media pressure accomplished what legal arguments couldn't. The federal civil rights lawsuit was 47 pages of legal language that boiled down to a simple premise. Ray Morrison, and the city that employed him, owed me $30 million for destroying my life. Sarah had spent 3 months crafting the complaint, documenting every constitutional violation, every piece of suppressed evidence, every day of wrongful imprisonment that Morrison's misconduct had caused. I held the lawsuit in Sarah's office, feeling the weight of paper that represented my best chance at real justice. The document was dense with legal citations and factual allegations, but the story it told was brutally clear. Detective Morrison had framed an innocent man to advance his career, and the city had enabled his misconduct through willful blindness and systemic corruption. Section 1983 Civil Rights Violation, Brady Violation, Conspiracy to Deprive Civil Rights, Intentional Infliction of Emotional Distress, and Malicious Prosecution, Sarah explained, pointing to different sections of the complaint. We're going after Morrison personally, and the city institutionally. The damages calculation was spelled out in excruciating detail. 14 years of lost wages as an automotive technician, conservatively estimated at $65,000 per year. Lost earning potential due to technological advances I'd missed during imprisonment. Medical expenses for health problems caused by prison conditions. Pain and suffering for psychological trauma. Punitive damages to deter future misconduct. But the real heart of the lawsuit wasn't the money, it was the pattern of corruption we'd documented across Morrison's career. The complaint included details about 6 other cases where Morrison had used similar tactics, suppressing exculpatory evidence, coaching witnesses, and manipulating crime scenes to support predetermined theories of guilt. This is bigger than your case, Sarah said as we reviewed the filing. We're alleging systematic constitutional violations by an entire police department. If we win, it won't just compensate you, it'll force reform that protects future innocent suspects. The high-profile civil rights attorney Sarah had partnered with was Michael Chunigan. No relation to Sarah, despite the shared name. Michael specialized in police misconduct cases and had won several multi-million-dollar settlements against law enforcement agencies that violated citizens' constitutional rights. 30 million sounds like a lot, Michael had explained during our first strategy meeting, but it's actually conservative given the scope of misconduct we're alleging. Wrongful imprisonment cases typically settle for 1 to 2 million per year served. Your case involves not just wrongful imprisonment, but systematic corruption that affected multiple victims. The lawsuit also named the city as a defendant, alleging that Morrison's supervisors had enabled his misconduct through policies that prioritized conviction rates over constitutional compliance. Internal police department emails showed that commanders knew about Morrison's unusually high clearance rate but never questioned his methods. Monel liability, Sarah explained, referring to the legal doctrine that allowed citizens to sue municipalities for constitutional violations. We're arguing that the city created a culture where officers like Morrison could violate rights with impunity, as long as they produced results. Filing the lawsuit had required months of preparation. We'd deposed witnesses, analyzed evidence, and built a timeline of Morrison's misconduct that spanned his entire career. Each allegation in the complaint was supported by documentary evidence, internal memos, case files, witness statements, and forensic analysis. The complaint included devastating details about my specific case. Morrison's memo about the bank security footage, his failure to run DNA evidence against criminal databases that would have identified Carlos Mendez as the actual perpetrator, his coaching of witnesses who initially gave descriptions that didn't match my appearance. But we'd also uncovered evidence about Morrison's other victims. Daniel Rodriguez, who'd served 8 years for an assault he didn't commit, based on coached witness testimony. Maria Santos, whose brother was serving life for murder based on evidence that had mysteriously disappeared from the crime scene. 3. Families whose lives had been destroyed by Morrison's ambition. The pattern is clear, the lawsuit argued. Morrison systematically violated the constitutional rights of suspects in order to advance his career through high conviction rates. The city rewarded this misconduct with promotions and commendations, creating a policy of deliberate indifference to citizens' constitutional rights. The $30 million demand wasn't arbitrary. Michael had analyzed similar cases across the country, looking at settlements and jury awards in wrongful conviction lawsuits. Pennsylvania had no compensation statute for exonerees, unlike states that automatically paid wrongfully convicted people for their lost years. We're asking for what the state should have provided automatically, Michael explained. Compensation for lost income, medical care for prison-related health problems, and recognition that constitutional violations deserve meaningful consequences. The lawsuit also sought injunctive relief court orders requiring the police department to implement reforms that would prevent future wrongful convictions, mandatory recording of interrogations, independent review of evidence suppression allegations, and training programs about constitutional requirements for criminal investigations. The city's initial response had been predictably defensive. Their statement to the media claimed that my lawsuit was a frivolous attempt to profit from technicalities, and that the original investigation had followed proper procedures. They seemed to hope that calling DNA evidence a technicality would somehow diminish its impact, but the lawsuit was already having effects beyond the courtroom. City council members were asking uncomfortable questions about police department policies. Internal Affairs was reviewing other cases Morrison had handled, and most importantly, other potential victims were coming forward with stories of similar misconduct. The 47-page document represented more than legal strategy, was a public record of everything Morrison had done to me and others, like me. Even if we never went to trial, the lawsuit had created a permanent record of his corruption that couldn't be buried in police files or explained away by department spokespersons. This is our declaration of war, Sarah said as we prepared to file the complaint in federal court. Morrison destroyed your life to build his career. Now we're going to destroy his career to rebuild your life. The lawsuit was my chance to fight back using the same system that had failed me. But this time, I had evidence, competent attorneys, and public attention focused on the truth Morrison had tried to bury for 14 years. Morrison's resignation letter was exactly what I'd expected from the man who destroyed my life. 2 paragraphs of self-serving bureaucratic language that avoided any admission of guilt or expression of remorse. Sarah handed me the letter in her office, fresh from the fax machine at City Hall, where Morrison had submitted it 20 minutes after the district attorney announced criminal charges against him. Effective immediately, I am resigning my position as chief of police to focus on addressing false allegations that have been made against my character and professional conduct. I have served this community with integrity for over 25 years and will vigorously defend myself against these meritless accusations. I remain confident that the truth will vindicate my record of dedicated service to public safety. The truth. Morrison was still talking about truth as if he hadn't spent his entire career burying it under layers of manufactured evidence and coached testimony, even facing criminal charges for conspiracy, evidence tampering, and civil rights violations. He couldn't bring himself to acknowledge what he'd done to me and countless other innocent people. The investigation that led to his downfall had moved faster than any of us expected. Once my lawsuit became public, the FBI had opened a civil rights investigation into Morrison's conduct. Federal agents had interviewed every suspect in every case Morrison had worked, looking for patterns of constitutional violations that might support federal charges. What they found was worse than even I had imagined. Morrison hadn't just suppressed evidence in my case, he'd turned evidence manipulation into an art form, perfecting techniques for manufacturing guilt that he'd used against dozens of innocent people over his career. The FBI had uncovered a conspiracy that reached beyond Morrison to include prosecutors, evidence technicians, and administrative personnel who'd helped him cover his tracks. Assistant District Attorney Patricia Wells was facing her own criminal charges for knowingly using perjured testimony and suppressed evidence to secure convictions she knew were false. Morrison's press conference the day before his resignation had been a masterclass in deflection and denial. Standing behind a podium in his dress uniform, surrounded by flags and photos of himself receiving commendations, he blamed everyone except himself for the investigation that was destroying his career. These allegations are politically motivated, attacks by defense attorneys and criminal rights activists who want to undermine effective law enforcement, Morrison had declared, reading from prepared remarks, while avoiding eye contact with reporters. I have dedicated my life to protecting this community from dangerous criminals, and I will not be intimidated by false accusations. But the evidence against Morrison was overwhelming. The FBI had found the original bank security footage that he'd hidden, stored in a filing cabinet in his office basement, along with evidence from dozens of other cases. Digital forensics had recovered deleted emails showing his coordination with prosecutors to suppress exculpatory evidence. The most damaging revelation came from Morrison's own case notes, which the FBI had seized during raids on his home and office. Morrison had actually documented his evidence suppression activities, apparently believing his methods were so sophisticated that he'd never be caught. Witness number 2 description, inconsistent with suspect profile. One note read, schedule follow-up. Interviewed to clarify recollection, translation, coach the witness until their testimony matches our theory of the case. Security footage shows different suspect build. Another note stated, file as miscellaneous evidence pending further investigation. Translation, hide evidence that proves our suspect is innocent. Morrison had been so confident in his corruption that he'd created a paper trail of constitutional violations spanning his entire career. The FBI found evidence that he'd framed innocent people in at least 18 different cases, sending men and women to prison for crimes they didn't commit while the real perpetrators remained free. The criminal charges against Morrison were extensive: conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law, evidence, tampering, obstruction of justice, perjury, and mail fraud. Each count carried potential prison sentences that meant Morrison could spend the rest of his life behind bars. Ironic justice for a man who'd stolen so many years from innocent people. But Morrison's resignation letter revealed his continued arrogance and self-delusion. Even facing overwhelming evidence of his crimes, he portrayed himself as the victim of a conspiracy by criminal rights activists and defense attorneys who wanted to undermine effective law enforcement. The impact of Morrison's downfall extended far beyond his individual case. The police department was facing a federal consent decree requiring independent oversight of criminal investigations. The district attorney's office was reviewing every case Morrison had touched, potentially leading to dozens of additional exonerations. 3 other officers who'd worked under Morrison were suspended, pending investigation. 2 prosecutors who'd collaborated with his evidence suppression were forced to resign. The entire criminal justice system in our county was being reorganized to prevent future wrongful convictions. Morrison's wife had filed for divorce. According to news reports that detailed the collapse of his personal life, along with his professional reputation, his adult children had publicly distanced themselves from their father, issuing statements expressing sympathy for his victims and support for criminal justice reform. The resignation letter also mentioned Morrison's intention to vigorously defend himself against criminal charges, but his legal prospects were grim. With documentary evidence of his conspiracy and testimony from multiple victims, his defense attorneys were likely advising him to negotiate a plea bargain rather than risk trial. Reading Morrison's resignation letter, I felt a complex mix of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction because the man who destroyed my life was finally facing consequences for his crimes. Sadness because his downfall couldn't restore the 14 years he'd stolen from me, couldn't repair my destroyed relationships, couldn't undo the damage he'd inflicted on so many innocent families. But Morrison's resignation represented more than personal vindication. It was proof that even corrupt cops, who climb to the top of their profession, aren't beyond the reach of justice. The letter that tried to portray him as a victim would become evidence in his criminal trial. Another document in the growing file of his arrogance and corruption. The man who'd once seemed untouchable, protected by his badge and political connections, was now just another defendant facing the same criminal justice system he'd corrupted. His resignation letter was his final act as police chief, and it perfectly captured the narcissism and moral blindness that had defined his entire career. The settlement agreement arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, 8 months after filing my lawsuit. 30 pages of legal language that boiled down to a simple acknowledgement. The city would pay me $30 million for the 14 years Morrison had stolen from my life. Sarah placed the document on her conference table like it was made of gold, which in many ways it was my ticket to financial security and public vindication. The city of Riverside agrees to pay plaintiff Marcus Williams the sum of $30 million in full settlement of all claims arising from his wrongful conviction and imprisonment. The agreement stated in formal legal language that couldn't capture the magnitude of what those words meant for my future, but the settlement was about more than money. The agreement included comprehensive police department reforms that would protect future innocent suspects from Morrison's type of corruption, mandatory recording of all interrogations, independent review of evidence suppression allegations, civilian oversight of internal affairs investigations, and annual training on constitutional requirements for criminal investigations. They're essentially admitting that Morrison's misconduct was systemic, Sarah explained as we reviewed each provision. These reforms acknowledged that the department's policies and culture enabled constitutional violations. The settlement also established a conviction review unit, an independent office that would examine questionable cases and identify potential wrongful convictions. The unit would be staffed by attorneys with no connection to the prosecutor's office, eliminating conflicts of interest that had allowed Morrison's victims to languish in prison for years. Michael Chen had negotiated additional provisions that went beyond typical settlement agreements. The city agreed to issue a public apology acknowledging my innocence and the misconduct that led to my wrongful conviction. More importantly, they agreed to waive governmental immunity for other victims of Morrison's crimes, clearing the way for additional lawsuits. That immunity waiver is unprecedented, Michael had told me during settlement negotiations. Usually cities fight tooth and nail to protect themselves from liability. But the evidence against Morrison was so overwhelming that they decided cooperation was better than continued litigation. The financial terms were structured to provide both immediate compensation and long-term security. $10 million would be paid immediately, with the remaining $20 million invested in a trust fund that would provide me with steady income for the rest of my life. I'd never have to worry about employment discrimination or financial insecurity again. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the settlement was the acknowledgement of Morrison's criminal behavior. The agreement included language stating that the city does not dispute the factual allegations regarding Detective Morrison's misconduct and acknowledges that Mr. Williams was the victim of deliberate constitutional violations. This wasn't a settlement where the city admitted no wrongdoing while paying money to make the problem disappear. This was a formal acknowledgement that their employee had committed crimes against innocent citizens, and that the department's culture had enabled those crimes. Morrison himself was facing his own reckoning. 2 weeks before our settlement was finalized, he'd pleaded guilty to federal civil rights violations in exchange for a recommended sentence of 15 years in prison. The plea agreement required him to cooperate with ongoing investigations into other potential victims of his misconduct. 15 years, Sarah had said when we learned about Morrison's plea deal. He'll serve approximately the same amount of time he stole from you. There's something poetic about that. The plea agreement also required Morrison to forfeit his police pension and any benefits he'd accrued during his career. The man who'd built his retirement on wrongful convictions would now face his own incarceration with no financial security. His victim's compensation would come partly from the pension he'd forfeited. The settlement had immediate effects beyond my personal situation. Daniel Rodriguez was exonerated based on evidence that emerged during the Morrison investigation. Maria Santos's brother had his murder conviction overturned when it was discovered that Morrison had hidden evidence pointing to a different suspect. 3 other families received justice that had been denied for years. The Conviction Review Unit had already identified 12 additional cases that warranted investigation. Each case represented another family torn apart by Morrison's ambition, another innocent person whose life had been destroyed by systematic corruption. But now there was hope for justice, accountability, and compensation. The police department's reforms were being implemented under federal oversight, with court-appointed monitors ensuring compliance with constitutional requirements. New protocols required supervisory review of evidence handling, independent verification of witness testimony, and mandatory disclosure of all potentially exculpatory evidence. These reforms will outlast all of us. The federal monitor, Judge Rebecca Martinez, had told the media they're designed to prevent future Morrison-type scandals by building transparency and accountability into every aspect of criminal investigations. The settlement agreement represented vindication not just for me, but for everyone who'd believed in my innocence when the system demanded their faith in my guilt. It was proof that truth eventually surfaces, no matter how deeply corrupt officials try to bury it. Reading the settlement terms, I thought about the 14-year-old version of myself who'd first walked into Riverside Correctional confused and terrified but still believing that justice would prevail. That young man couldn't have imagined the long journey ahead, the family relationships that would be destroyed, the legal battles that would consume years of his life, but he also couldn't have imagined this moment, holding a document that not only compensated him for his suffering, but created systemic changes that would protect others from experiencing similar injustice. The settlement agreement was more than personal vindication. It was a blueprint for criminal justice reform. Morrison's victims would finally receive justice. Future innocent suspects would be protected by new safeguards, and the corrupt system that had enabled constitutional violations would be replaced by transparency and accountability. The settlement agreement represented the end of one fight and the beginning of a larger movement for reform. The foundation charter sat on my new desk in an office I'd never imagined owning. Legal documents that transformed my settlement money into something larger than personal compensation. The Marcus Williams Foundation for Wrongful Conviction Prevention would use my $30 million to help other innocent people fight the same battles I'd fought, ensuring that Morrison's other victims, and future victims of similar corruption, wouldn't face their struggles alone. The Foundation's mission, I read from the charter Sarah had helped me draft, is to provide legal assistance, investigative resources, and financial support to individuals who have been wrongfully convicted of crimes they did not commit, while advocating for criminal justice reforms that prevent future wrongful convictions. It had been 2 years since my exoneration, 18 months since Morrison began serving his 15-year federal sentence, and 6 months since our settlement was finalized. In that time, I'd transformed from a man struggling to survive in a halfway house to someone with the resources and platform to create meaningful change in the system that had failed so many innocent people. The Foundation's first office was in downtown Philadelphia, close enough to major courts and law schools to attract talented attorneys, but far enough from my old life to represent a true fresh start. I'd hired Maria Santos, the paralegal who'd first believed in my case, as executive director, along with a staff of investigators, social workers, and victim advocates who understood the unique challenges faced by exonerees. Our first major case was Daniel Rodriguez, whose wrongful conviction had been overturned based on evidence uncovered during the Morrison investigation. Daniel had served 8 years for an assault he didn't commit, and like me, he'd emerged from prison to find a world that had moved on without him. The Foundation provided him with temporary housing, job training, and legal assistance in pursuing his own civil rights lawsuit. "You saved my life," Daniel had told me during our first meeting, "not just by exposing Morrison, but by showing me that innocent people can fight back and win." The Foundation had also taken on the case of James Patterson, a man serving life without parole for a murder that Morrison had pinned on him, using the same evidence suppression techniques he'd used against me. James had been writing letters from prison for 12 years, maintaining his innocence while his appeals were routinely denied. Now he had competent legal representation and investigative resources that were already uncovering the misconduct that had sent him to death row. But beyond individual cases, the Foundation was working on systemic reforms that would prevent future wrongful convictions. We'd lobbied for legislation requiring automatic compensation for exonerees, mandatory recording of interrogations, and independent oversight of evidence handling procedures. 3 states had already passed bills based on our reform proposals. My relationship with my family had slowly begun to heal, though it would never return to what it had been before my arrest. Jennifer had finally told her daughters about their uncle who'd been wrongfully imprisoned, and Tyler, now 28 and a software engineer, had reached out to rebuild our relationship. The conversations were awkward and painful, but they were conversations, which was more than I'd had for 14 years. "I'm sorry we gave up on you," Tyler had said during our first meeting since my release. "I should have remembered you better. I should have questioned what I was told." "You were 12, I'd replied. "The adults in your life made decisions that weren't your fault." Mom had attended the Foundation's launch ceremony, sitting in the front row while I spoke about turning personal tragedy into systemic change. She approached me afterward with tears in her eyes, saying words I'd waited 16 years to hear. "I'm proud of you, son. Your father would be proud too." The Foundation charter represented more than legal incorporation. It was my declaration that Morrison's crimes would ultimately serve a purpose beyond personal enrichment. Every dollar of the settlement money that went toward helping innocent people was a dollar that transformed injustice into justice, corruption into reform. Morrison himself had become a cautionary tale taught in law schools and police academies across the country. His case was cited in legal briefs, academic papers, and training materials as an example of how unchecked ambition and institutional corruption could destroy innocent lives. The man who'd once been celebrated as a model law enforcement officer was now synonymous with everything wrong with American criminal justice. The most meaningful moments came when other exonerees contacted the Foundation for help. Men and women who'd lost years or decades to wrongful convictions, emerging from prison to find themselves forgotten by society and abandoned by the system that had failed them. Each person who walked through our doors represented not just another case, but another opportunity to prove that justice delayed doesn't have to mean justice denied. Standing in my office, reading the Foundation charter that would guide our work for years to come, I thought about the journey that had brought me here, from inmate number 47,291 to Foundation president, from victim to advocate, from a man destroyed by corruption to someone with the power to fight that corruption systematically. The charter concluded with language that captured everything I'd learned about justice during my long fight for freedom. True justice requires not just the vindication of individual innocence, but the transformation of systems that enable injustice. The Marcus Williams Foundation commits to fighting for both one innocent person at a time, one corrupt practice at a time, one systemic reform at a time. Morrison had stolen 14 years of my life, destroyed my family relationships, and cost me experiences I could never recover. But his crimes had also given me a purpose larger than anything I could have imagined before my arrest. The Foundation would be his unintended legacy, proof that even the most corrupt official couldn't permanently bury truth or prevent justice. I was Marcus Williams, 44 years old, and I'd survived 14 years of wrongful imprisonment to build something that would protect other innocent people from suffering the same fate. The Foundation charter in my hands was more than legal documentation. It was my promise that Morrison's victims would find justice, and that his methods would never again destroy innocent lives with impunity. This was my new beginning. Built on the ashes of everything Morrison had tried to destroy,